Në programin e të shtunës së kaluar, ju njoftuam për intervistën që i morëm Margaret Macmillan, autores së librit historik Paris 1919, 6 muajt që ndryshuan botën. Është një libër që trajton ngjarjet e konferencës që ndryshe njihet edhe si konferenca e Versailles, në të cilën palët fituese nga lufta e parë botërore rishikuan kufijtë e shumë vendeve të botës duke parashkruar luftra dhe konflikte të tjera që edhe sot mbeten të pazgjidhura. Është konferenca në të cilën vetëm ndërhyrja e presidentit amerikan Wilson do ta shpëtonte Shqipërinë nga ndarja përfundimtare midis fqinjëve të saj të uritur për tokat shqiptare. Por përpara se të transmetojmë të plot intervistën me autoren e këtij libri, le të njihemi shkurtimisht me rrethanat se si ky libër njohu rrugën e botimit edhe në gjuhën shqipe. Ja se çfarë tregon një nga sponsorizuesit e këtij botimi.
Kur e lexova këtë libër para 2 vjetësh, më ka bërë shumë përshtypje si një libër shumë profesional, ndërkohë i thjesht që i lidhte faktet dhe arsyetonte mbi bazën e fakteve. Dhe fliste, ndërkohë që fliste për një ngjarje mjaft të rëndësishme, siç është konferenca e paqes mas luftës së parë botërore. Ky libër ishte i rëndësishëm sepse i merrte në analizë të hollë si njerëzit, si vendimet e tyre të mëdha dhe të rëndësishme që merrshin, dhe jeptesh në mënyrë të qartë ndikimin që kishin të mëdhenjt tek të vegjëlit dhe të vegjëlit tek të mëdhenjt. Pra aty ndërthureshin dhe ndesheshin interesa nga vetjake deri tek interesa shtetërore dhe kombëtare. Ky libër ka një rëndësi edhe në lidhje me shkrimin e historisë. Është një libër profesional nga i cili historianët, dhe në rastin ton historianët shqiptar, kanë shumë për të mësuar se si shkruhet historia.
Miss Macmillan, I'm honored to have you today as our special guest. You have written a book that has received a number of international awards and prizes, and you as a writer have been highly regarded by many book reviewers. Could you please tell us how long it took to write this book?
Oh, it was a project that took a very long time because I became interested in it sometime in the 1970s. And I began gathering material and I began thinking about it. And there's an enormous amount of material because the peace conference in Paris in 1919 covered most of the world, including, of course, Albania, but it covered the world from China to Africa to Europe to North America. So I gathered a lot of material and I started writing very seriously at the beginning of the 1990s. And it probably took me about 3 or 4 years to actually write the book.
Were there any particular circumstances that made you choose this topic? For instance, the fact that you are the great-granddaughter of David Lloyd George, one of the big fours.
I don't think my great-grandfather was so much a factor as the fact that I'm an historian and I teach history. And I teach modern history, and so often when I was talking about a subject, for example, Yugoslavia, the Balkans, the center of Europe, I would have to go back to the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. And so over the years it came to seem to me a very, very interesting international conference. And the people who were there, of course, were very interesting as well, because you had people from all parts of the world. You had the American president, the French prime minister, the British prime minister, and so on. And so I think that's what drew me into it. But clearly I think I had some interest because of my family. And I heard stories from my grandmother, who I knew very well, and my great-aunt, both of whom went to visit their father in Paris and met some of the people who were actually there. So, yes, I think that helped me to be interested.
In the interest of our Albanian viewers, I would like you to tell us about the main factors that saved Albania at the peace conference in Paris from being divided between Greece, Serbia, and Italy.
I think the main factor was probably that the Balkans had been the product of so much trouble and had caused 2 wars before 1914, before the First World War. And the borders had been set with such difficulties. I mean, as you know, Albania only came into existence as a state in the modern age in 1912. And so I think there was a general feeling among those who met in Paris that they didn't want to reopen it, that the Balkans had produced so much trouble. Indeed, the assassination of the Archduke Francis Ferdinand at Sarajevo in June 1914 had really helped to set the First World War off. And so I think there was a general understanding that they had better not touch the borders in the Balkans again because they might get themselves into real trouble.
Richard Holbrooke, the American mediator at the Bosnian War, in his foreword expresses his regret that this book was not available 10 years ago. Now that Paris 1919 is available, do you think it can still be useful to prevent any other wars in any region of the world penalized by the decisions of the peace conference?
Well, it was very nice of Ambassador Richard Holbrooke to say that, and I think he was being very kind. I'm not sure that history can tell us how to prevent wars, but I think what history can do is give us the background to understand issues. That if you don't know the history, for example, of Yugoslavia, if you don't know the history of the Balkans, you don't understand why in the present there are certain friendships and certain hatreds among different peoples. And I think you need to understand that. If you don't understand, for example, how Kosovo came to be part of Yugoslavia, and you don't understand something of the history of Kosovo and something of the relationship between the Albanians in Kosovo and the Albanians living in Albania, then you don't understand a good deal of what is going on in that part of the world today. I think what history can also do, very helpfully, is give us warnings that if you want to make a lasting peace, you have to make sure that you bring the defeated and the victors together, and you have to make a peace that is workable. You have to make an agreement that will actually work. And that's, of course, what Richard Holbrooke helped to do with the Dayton Accords at the end of the wars in the Balkans in the 1990s. He helped, of course, President Clinton did a great deal, but he helped to bring the different sides together so they could hammer out an agreement that would actually work.
In your pages on the Albanian question, you wrote, "Poor Albania, with such powerful enemies and so few friends." Is this sympathetic comment a sign that the spirit of Edith Durham lives on?
Oh, I think Albania's always had a great deal of sympathy. I mean, I think anyone who got to Albania in the beginning of the 20th century, or even earlier, like Byron, the great British poet, was always fascinated by the country, always found it very beautiful, always found its people very charming and very interesting. But I think there was also a feeling that Albania was too poor and too remote a part of the world to have any real friends. Many British were sympathetic to Albania, but it was too far away from Great Britain for them to really want to be able to do very much about it. And if you looked at Albania's neighbours, particularly after the First World War, most of them had designs on Albanian territory. I mean, Greece was very interested in the southern part of Albania. The Italians, of course, would like to have taken the whole of Albania, but they were particularly interested in the ports along the coast. And then in the north you had the new state of Yugoslavia, which also had designs on Albania. And Albania really had very few protectors. The British were sympathetic, but as I say, they were too far away. The French were sympathetic, but they had other interests and other concerns, and the Italians, much closer at hand, were definitely unsympathetic.
Ever been to the Balkans, including Albania?
I've been to the Balkans, but not to Albania. I've sailed down part of the coast of Croatia, down the Istrian Peninsula and further south. And when I was very young, I took a train from, I think it was from Venice to Athens. And you go through Zagreb and Belgrade and Skopje and down that way. But I regret to say that I've never been to Albania, and I very much hope I'll get there one day.
Recently, your book was also printed in Albanian, thanks to also Mr. Lolia, who pushed the Albanian publishing house to translate and print it in our language. What is your comment on that?
I was absolutely delighted. I remember it must have been about 2 years ago that Mr. Loya got in touch with me and said that there would be an interest in publishing my book in Albanian and translating it into Albanian. And I was absolutely thrilled because I thought it would probably be impossible that Albanians would be able to translate it. I don't mean that they wouldn't know the English, but translating books is very complex and takes a long time. And I thought, why would they bother? Because it's quite a fat book. And so I was very, very pleased. And I suppose, I can only suppose that there must be quite an interest in history in Albania and people wanting to know about the recent world and what produced the world in which they live.
Are you already on the next project?
I am. I've just finished writing a book on the visit by President Nixon to China in 1972, which was a very important visit, which marked the end of a period where the United States and the People's Republic of China had no relationship. And it marked the beginning of this very important and often very troubled relationship which exists between the United States and China today. And so this book will be coming out in Canada and in the United Kingdom this autumn, and then it'll be coming out in the United States after Christmas. And who knows, maybe it'll be translated again. That would be nice.
Are you aware that this visit served to Enver Hoxha as a pretext to break the relationship with China?
Well, I did know something about that because Enver Hoxha wrote a diary and wrote many comments, parts of which have been translated into English. And I read parts of it, and he was very, very angry when Nixon went to China and wrote very rude things and said the Chinese were becoming capitalists and fascists and didn't know what they were doing. So no, and I do quote him in my book because he provides a very interesting commentary.
Thank you so much for sharing your time with our viewers, and it was a pleasure meeting you.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me. I was delighted.